All right, welcome back to the deep dive. Today we're diving into, well, a topic that, might make some people a little uncomfortable, might not be something we hear about every day,
Right.
but it's definitely worth exploring. And our listeners, you guys are curious. You sent us some really interesting material, this podcast called Unheard Voices, The Exploitation of Men in Indian Society.
Yeah, that's a powerful title, Unheard Voices. It really grabs your attention, doesn't it?
It does.
And I think it speaks to, the whole mission of the podcast itself. They're trying to shed light on these issues that often get overlooked. And
Right.
specifically, in this case, they're looking at the exploitation of men in India.
And it sounds like it's not just like one narrow thing, right? They're covering a whole range of different aspects of
No,
this.
it's multifaceted, definitely.
Yeah.
They talk about things like, the challenges men face in the workplace, some of the complexities of the legal system, emotional manipulation, even.
Which is something that I think is really interesting because it's not something we talk about that often, the emotional side of it.
Right.
And then also, the issue of forced labor overseas. I mean, that's a whole other level.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
So it's a pretty comprehensive look at this issue.
So let's really get into it then. Right from the start, Unheard Voices lays out just how broad this exploitation can be, and it's kind of shocking, honestly. Like they talk about workplace exploitation, and one thing that really stuck out to me was this intense pressure that they describe that many men in India face as, being the primary breadwinners.
Mhm.
And how that can, I mean, it just makes them so vulnerable, right, to being exploited in their jobs.
It absolutely does. I mean, you can imagine, right? If you're the sole provider for your family, you might feel like you have no choice but to accept a job,
Right.
even if it's, paying you less than you deserve or if the conditions are unsafe.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, it's that basic need to provide for your family. It can really outweigh any other concerns, unfortunately.
And what's interesting is, they talk about how these cultural expectations
Yeah.
around, male responsibility, they actually contribute to this problem.
Right. It's like a double-edged sword.
It is.
Yeah.
It is. Because, from a young age, men are taught that they're supposed to be the providers, the strong ones, the ones who don't complain. And so when they're facing these exploitative conditions, they might feel like they're failing somehow if they speak up or try to change things.
And that must be really tough because then it's not just the external pressure of the job, it's also that internal pressure, that feeling like you're not living up to some kind of, ideal.
Exactly. It's a heavy burden to carry.
And then there's the legal side of things. Unheard Voices really, doesn't shy away from talking about what they call legal exploitation.
Mhm.
And they focus a lot on the really serious consequences of false accusations. I mean, particularly when it comes to things like domestic violence, dowry disputes, or sexual harassment. They talk about how someone's life can just be completely ruined based on claims that aren't even true.
Yeah, and this is a really sensitive area, obviously.
Absolutely.
But it's important to talk about. I mean, the podcast raises these concerns about how the legal system itself can be manipulated,
Yeah.
and how laws that are intended to protect people, particularly women in these cases,
Mhm.
can sometimes be misused, and that can have really devastating effects on the men who are accused.
Yeah, it's like you want to have those protections in place, for people who are vulnerable,
Right.
but at the same time, you also want to make sure that the system is fair, that it's not being abused.
Exactly. And the podcast doesn't go into, specific legal details or anything, but they do mention, when they're talking about dowry disputes, for example.
Mhm.
This is often, a conflict that arises from this traditional practice where the bride's family gives gifts or money to the groom's family.
Hmm.
And there are laws in place to prevent, the coercive aspects of that. But the podcast suggests that, sometimes those laws are misused.
Right, right. It's a complex issue for sure.
It is. It
But
is.
it's not just about the workplace and the legal system.
No.
Unheard Voices also gets into this whole area of emotional exploitation,
Yeah.
which, as I mentioned before, I think is really interesting because it's often so hidden.
It is. It's
Yeah.
it's a lot more subtle, right, than some of these other forms of exploitation.
Yeah.
And they talk about how it can happen within relationships, within marriages,
Mm.
and it could lead to, some really serious mental health challenges for men. And again, I think this goes back to those societal norms we were talking about earlier.
Right. The whole like man up mentality.
Yeah, exactly. Men are often discouraged from expressing their emotions, from seeking help, from, appearing vulnerable in any way.
Right.
And so when they're being emotionally manipulated, they might not even recognize it as abuse.
Right, or they might feel ashamed to admit it.
Exactly. And that can be really damaging,
Yeah.
in the long run.
And, it's not just about men either, right? I mean, these kinds of restrictive gender roles, they hurt everyone.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, women are obviously affected by them as well, but in different ways.
Yeah. Yeah, it's a whole system that needs to be kind of reevaluated, I think.
I agree. I agree.
And then there's one more aspect of exploitation that they cover that's really disturbing, and that's forced labor abroad.
Hmm.
I mean, they talk about these cases of Indian men being lured overseas with promises of, good jobs and better lives, but then they end up, basically trapped in these horrific situations.
Yeah, and it's often, people who are desperate for work, who are maybe struggling financially, who are, willing to take risks to try to improve their situation.
Hmm.
And they become targets for these unscrupulous individuals or organizations who, you know, exploit that desperation.
And take advantage of, the fact that they might not be familiar with the laws or the customs in those other countries.
Exactly, exactly.
So yeah, it's a really dark side of, globalization and the search for better opportunities.
It is. It's a reminder that, even as the world becomes more interconnected, there are still these huge inequalities that exist, and people can be really vulnerable to exploitation because of them.
So those are some of the different forms of exploitation that Unheard Voices talks about, but they don't just, leave it at that.
Right.
They actually go on to discuss, some specific recent incidents that really illustrate these issues, and one that they focus on is the case of Benil Babu, which is
Yeah.
just it's heartbreaking.
It is. It is. I mean, this story really, really gets to you. It was reported in the Times UK, and essentially what happened was this man, Benil Babu, he thought he was going to Poland for a job as an electrician,
Mm-hmm.
and he ended up, being tricked into joining the Russian military, and he actually died in Ukraine.
Yeah, it's so tragic, and it really shows how far this exploitation can go,
It does, and the podcast points out that this is just one example, but it's representative of a larger problem, right? Of people who are, so desperate for work that they're willing to believe these promises, even if they seem, a little too good to be true.
Yeah, yeah. And it also highlights the need for, more regulation of these recruitment practices, especially when it comes to, sending people overseas.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Another example that Unheard Voices mentions is a documentary called India's Sons.
Yes.
And this one focuses on men who've been falsely accused of crimes, particularly, dowry harassment and domestic abuse. Right.
And it's really powerful because it shows how these accusations, even if they're not true, can lead to, men being wrongfully imprisoned, losing their families, their
Yeah.
jobs, their reputations.
It's devastating. And what's so striking is that the podcast actually references, even the Supreme Court of India has used this term, legal terrorism, in relation to Section 498A of the Indian Penal Code, which deals with dowry harassment.
Yeah. That's a pretty strong statement.
That is. It is. And it just shows how seriously, this issue is being taken, at least in some quarters.
Mhm.
And the podcast is careful to point out that they're not saying that, dowry harassment doesn't exist or that women aren't victims.
Right.
It's
right.
more about acknowledging that there's potential for these laws to be misused,
Yeah.
and that when they are misused, it can have these really, really terrible consequences for men.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I think the key is balance, right? You want to protect the vulnerable, but you also want to make sure that the system is fair.
And then the third incident that they talk about is about labor exploitation of Indian men in the UK.
Hmm.
And this one was actually reported in the India Express, and it talked about how, a significant number of men, particularly in this age group of 25 to 34, they're facing, unsafe working conditions. They're being paid below the minimum wage.
Right.
Yep.
Right. And this just shows that, this isn't just an issue within India itself, right? It's a global problem.
Mm-hmm.
And Indian men who are working abroad, they might be even more vulnerable to this kind of exploitation because they might not be as familiar with the laws in those countries. They might not speak the language fluently.
Right, or they might be afraid to, report abuse because of their immigration status.
Exactly. Exactly. So it's a really complex issue, and it's one that, needs to be addressed on a global level.
Okay, so we've talked about the scope of the problem. We've talked about some specific examples. And now Unheard Voices kind of shifts gears a little bit and starts to analyze the causes of this exploitation, which I think is really important, to understand why this is happening.
Absolutely. I mean,
Whoa.
you can't really solve a problem unless you understand the root causes, right?
Right, right. And one of the first things they point to is patriarchal expectations. That whole idea that men have to be strong and silent, that they can't show weakness or ask for help.
And that they have to be the provider.
Yeah, yeah. And it seems like this is a huge obstacle, for men who are experiencing exploitation because it prevents them from speaking up, from seeking support.
It does. It
Yeah.
does. I mean, it's almost like they're trapped in this cycle of silence and suffering,
Yeah.
And it's really sad because, everyone needs help sometimes. Everyone needs to be able to talk about their problems, and men shouldn't be any different.
No, absolutely not. But it's so ingrained, isn't it? This idea of what it means to be a man.
It is. It is. And it's something that needs to change.
Right.
We need to start teaching boys from a young age that it's okay to express their emotions, that it's okay to ask for help,
Mm-hmm.
and that, strength doesn't mean hiding your pain. It means being able to confront it.
Yeah. Yeah. It's about being vulnerable, right?
Exactly.
And then another cause that Unheard Voices brings up is the one we talked about before, the legal loopholes
Yeah.
and the potential for misuse of laws that are meant to protect women.
Right.
And they even mentioned that term again, that the Supreme Court of India used legal terrorism,
Mm-hmm.
which is, it's a really powerful statement. And it shows that, even at the highest levels, there's this recognition that there are problems with the way some of these laws are being implemented.
Yeah, and I think what's important is that the podcast is trying to have a nuanced conversation about this, right?
Mm.
They're not saying that, all accusations are false or that women are never victims,
Right.
but they're saying that there needs to be more awareness of this potential for misuse and that there need to be safeguards in place to prevent it.
Yeah. Yeah. It's about finding that balance again, right?
Exactly.
Protecting the vulnerable, but also making sure that the system is fair for everyone.
Mm-hmm.
Unheard Voices also talks about something that, might be a little bit controversial, but it's definitely worth discussing, and that's the idea of unrealistic relationship demands.
Okay.
And they suggest that, in some cases, women might be exploiting men financially, emotionally, or even legally.
Right.
And they talk about, how some women might be leveraging societal expectations, to their advantage in relationships.
I see. Yeah, this is a really sensitive area, and I think it's important to be, to approach it carefully. But I do think it's valid to acknowledge that, exploitation can happen in any relationship, and it can go both ways. And podcast also touches on this issue of potential bias in things like divorce settlements, which is, another area where there's a lot of debate and a lot of complexity.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. For sure. And then finally, Unheard Voices points to workplace discrimination against men as another contributing factor to this exploitation.
Okay.
And they highlight the fact that, men often don't have the same level of legal protection against harassment that women do.
Right.
And they talk about, issues like bullying, excessive workloads, emotional pressure, all these things that men might face in the workplace. And they might not have the same avenues for reporting those issues or getting help.
Yeah, and this is an important point because, we often hear about, harassment against women in the workplace, which is obviously a huge problem.
Right.
But it's important to recognize that men can be victims of harassment as well.
Mm-hmm.
And that they might not have the same support systems in place.
So Unheard Voices doesn't just, lay out all these problems and then leave it at that, right?
Right.
They actually go on to offer some potential solutions, some pathways to change, which I think is really, encouraging. It gives you some hope that things can get better.
Yeah. It's not just, doom and gloom. They're actually trying to be constructive and offer some concrete ideas for how to address these issues.
So one of the first things they suggest is legal reform.
Mm-hmm.
And specifically, they advocate for stricter laws against false accusations.
Right.
And for ensuring that, the trial procedures are fair for all genders.
Mm-hmm.
Which makes sense, right?
Yeah.
Given everything we've talked about in terms of legal exploitation.
It does. I mean, if you want to address that problem, you have to start by making sure that the legal system itself is fair and just.
Exactly.
And that it's not, tilted in favor of one gender over another.
And then they also emphasize the importance of education and awareness.
Mm-hmm.
They talk about, educating boys about their rights, having more open conversations about men's well-being, both in schools and in families.
Yeah.
And also, they talk about the role of the media in portraying, more realistic and nuanced images of men and showing these cases of men's exploitation.
Yeah, and this is really crucial because, if we want to change these societal expectations,
Right.
we have to start by changing the narratives, right? We have
Yeah,
to show that, men can be victims, that it's okay for them to ask for help, and that strength doesn't mean, suppressing your emotions.
exactly, exactly. And then another pathway they talk about is equal workplace protection.
Right.
So advocating for, policies that protect men from harassment and exploitation in the workplace, just like there are policies in place to protect women.
And this is really important because, as we've talked about, there's often a gap there, right? Men might not have the same legal recourse,
Mm-hmm.
or they might not feel as comfortable coming forward with their experiences.
Yeah, yeah. And then finally, they talk about the need for a shift in societal expectations as a whole, encouraging families to raise boys in a way that allows them to be more emotionally open, to move away from these rigid gender roles.
Right.
And also, they talk about the importance of social campaigns that promote men's mental health awareness, which I think is so important.
It is. It is. I mean, men's mental health is often stigmatized, and there's this pressure on men to just, tough it out, to not talk about their feelings, and that
Okay.
can be really, really damaging.
So I think, bringing all of this together, it seems like the core message of Unheard Voices is that men in India, they do face these significant and diverse forms of exploitation,
Hmm.
and it's something that deserves attention. It deserves to be talked about.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And I think it's important to emphasize that this isn't about, comparing struggles or saying that men have it worse than women.
Right, right.
It's about acknowledging that exploitation can happen to anyone, regardless of their gender,
Mm.
and that we need to have a more nuanced and complete understanding of these issues if we want to truly address them.
So, for you, our listener who tunes into the deep dive, wanting to learn more about these complex issues,
Right.
I think this exploration of Unheard Voices is really valuable because it offers a perspective that you might not get from, mainstream media or from, kind of the dominant narratives.
It does. It really challenges you to think critically and to question your assumptions
Hmm.
and to consider the experiences of everyone, not just, the groups that we typically hear about.
So as we wrap up here, I want to leave you with this thought. How can we, as a society, create systems that are truly equitable, systems of justice, systems of support
Hmm.
that really take into account the vulnerabilities of all individuals, regardless of their gender?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it?
It is. It is. But I think it's one that we need to keep asking ourselves. And it's one that, hopefully this deep dive has given you some new perspectives on.
I think so. I think so.
All right. Well, thanks for joining us for another deep dive.
Thanks for having me. It's been a great conversation.
Until next time.
Yeah. See you then.